Many African countries over the years have been resilient and achieved great strides in changing perceptions on how the continent was perceived globally. But the current trade wars and ongoing conflicts in South Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo have created an uncertain future that might hinder the continent's economic growth. Now, amidst this, the African Union Commission's chairperson, Mahmoud Youssouf, says the continent is steadily building a future of peace, prosperity and integration. With South Africa's G20 presidency this year, it's hoped that the summit will be used to promote African countries to the global trade and investment stage. Now, to discuss this, we are joined virtually by Professor Eddy Maloka. He's a visiting professor at the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation at the University of Johannesburg. Professor, thank you very much for your time and welcome.
Good morning. Thank you very much. Yes.
Good to have you. So, Prof, when we look at Africa's progress in reshaping its global image over the last few decades, how would you rate it? How are we doing?
Look, I think there was a time when you could say that there was a time when, of course, our situation was more, is better now compared to before. After independence, of course, we were playing ground for superpowers. It was during the Cold War. Then we had, of course, the Southern Africa. We had South Africa. When South Africa came into the fold of the African continent after 1994, there was this reawakening, this hope, and perceptions also began changing in a positive direction with the African Renaissance and a lot of things. So you could say overall, it's much better than it were, let's say, in the 1980s, even before. And I think we've been able to do quite a lot of positive things that change the perceptions that used to be out there about Africa as a country of dictators and all of that. So that perception has changed quite a lot.
However, there's still a lot of work to be done, and I'm sure you would agree with me. But we look at the comments of the African Union Commission chairperson, which I said in the introduction, Mahmoud Youssouf, saying, steadily building a future of peace, prosperity and integration. Are we? Because when you look at the continent right now, we're plagued with terrible fighting, a lot of corruption, and the trade is something that we really need to work on. We have so many minerals, we are a wealthy continent, and yet the populations are poor. Let's talk to that.
No, definitely. I think, Leanne, the way I see it is that it's much better than before, because now you have, if you go around the continent, you see that the leaders are having conversation about those three issues, about peace, about development, and also about how you constitute a state in Africa that is accountable, that's also able to deliver for its own people. So there's been this, this major shift. And if you look at the conflicts that are happening today, it's not like before. The one in the eastern part of the DRC is largely a regional conflict. Sudan, it's something similar to what you had in Ethiopia a couple of years ago. So it's a conflict within the you could say the leaders in Sudan. They themselves will have to find solution. We, African Union, African countries, and the peaceful agreement for Ethiopia was signed here in South Africa. I expect that something like that will happen quite soon in the case of Sudan. But let me say that we are not going to have a complete 100% peace. It's not a precondition for Africa to move. It's possible that with the 54 countries we have, 1.4 billion people, we have that the majority, maybe 60% or so of the continent can carry the continent through. We still have, like, let's say in the Middle East, we have pockets of conflict, but other countries are able to move. Even in Europe now, even in the Americas, even in Asia, there are pockets of conflict, but the other countries are able to move forward. So I don't think that the incidence of conflict in 2-3 countries on the continent necessarily suggests that there is a regression, that the continent can move forward. The continent can be able to move forward, but we need leaders. We need a group of countries that can move us in the right direction.
So I love your sentiment, and I love that we can't judge on just, a few countries and the problems that they are going through. So my question to you is then, how would you say that this perception shift that you say it's a lot better since the 80s to now, how has it actually had a tangible economic and political benefit for the African continent?
Look, the issue is that if you look at the three issues, development, integration, and also peace and security. Integration, we're doing quite well. We've been able to create all these institutions. We have the regional economic communities. Relatively, we're doing, actually, I was arguing at some point that we are the best in the world in terms of integration, the way we've been able to establish this regional economic community. Peace and security is better than before, but we should be able to deal with these three conflicts that are still there, that are lingering. Development, that's an area that I think for me, it's a big challenge. It's an area where we are lagging behind the rest of the world. And for me, I think that what our leaders should be thinking about, because when we had the end of the Cold War, Salim Salim, who was the Secretary General of the Organization of African Unity at that time, the OAU, thought that the world is changing, we need to do something. And he brought leaders, they convened a summit called the OAU Summit, Fundamental Changes Taking Place in the World and How Africa Should Respond. And I think that's what we need now. We need a convention of African countries, of African citizens, African regional organizations to look at the world, to say the world is changing. And in order for us to move forward, we're going to need a group of countries, the leaders that are going to lead us in that direction that we want for this century. And that is what is missing. And I think that South Africa has a big role to play here. South Africa played a big role in constructing the world that is being replaced now under President Mbeki, President Mandela. And I think now what we need, South Africa should take the lead and really work with other countries, convene this convention of African countries to say the world is changing. What is it that we need to do? What are the things we need to do? Where are the things you are talking about? Sudan, how do we solve this problem? But we need a convention outside or in addition to the African Union, because the African Union works differently and does its own things differently. And then whatever comes out of this convention, then you take it into the African Union structures for formal decision. That is what is missing for Africa to meet and collectively reflect on the fundamental changes taking place in the world. What is it that we need? There are clear actions that we can take as Africa, and we have history to learn from that. And there are things that are positive that we can do in those three areas: development, peace and security, and of course, building capable states in Africa.
So let's put the Africa, the continental free trade area. I mean, this really is something that is there to promote economic development within the continent without relying on global superpowers such as the United States, Europe, and Asia. But how much power does it have, and are we utilizing this enough?
No, the CFTA is very minimum. It's a minimum standard in issues of trade. It's lower than, like here in Southern Africa, we've had for years, in fact, the oldest customs union. The SACU was established, the oldest customs union in the world. So it's not a customs union. And we've had for a couple of years here in SADC attempts to establish a free trade area, ECOWAS region as well as East Africa. There have been attempts to establish. So it's what it has achieved, which is very important. It's a continent-wide now attempt to try to consolidate these various attempts at sub-regional level to establish free trade areas. But it is not a customs union. It is not an African economic community. So it's still a long way to go. But what it has done is that it has created this framework for continent-wide integration in the area of trade. But we need African countries themselves. It's important that we up our intra-African trade, of course, but we must have goods to trade in, goods and services. So the manufacturing base is still a challenge. We need to work on that. And then the second thing that we need to work on is, of course, in connectivity, the infrastructure. And the problem we have in Africa with infrastructure connectivity, we don't have a continental body with financial resources to be able to implement this inter-country or cross-country infrastructure projects. We have policies, we have NEPAD, we have all of this, but we don't have a financial muscle to be able to do this. And it's something that I think that at this convention that I'm talking about, these are the things that we can look at. How do we create this kitty, this bag, these resources without relying on external people? Because we need to build a road from here to Zimbabwe, to Zambia, to all of those things. We don't have. So for CFTA to work, we need these connections. We need African manufacturing base. We need cross-country projects. But we don't have the financial resources to be able. We don't have a vehicle at the continental level. The African Union doesn't have it. SADC doesn't have it. If you look at Agenda 2063, you look at all our infrastructure projects. The assumption is that somebody out there, a big daddy, a blesser, is going to come from outside our continent and give us this money to be able to build this regional integration infrastructure project. So I think that's an area where we we really need to focus moving forward.
Yeah, and this is something that I think we need to focus on for just a little bit. I mean, we are seeing, just for an example, South Africa on a mission to reset its relations with the United States. And of course, it's not only South Africa, but I mean the continent as well. We've seen funding cuts from the US to many programs, which has become a very big problem. But we're also seeing trade wars between the United States and the rest of the world. But, you know, this could be a moment for Africa to benefit from. And
of course.
Exactly how? Yeah. What should we do? What is the first thing that you would advise?
We can't do it individually. We can't have, well, South Africa had to do it because it was targeted. There had to be that direct bilateral engagement. And of course, I think that we need to organize ourselves. That's why I'm making this point that let's repeat what Ahmed Salim did. When the world was changing at the end of the Cold War, he convened Africa and said, what is it? How do we respond? That is what is missing. We don't have this conversation happening. So we cannot do it bilaterally, piecemeal, piece by piece, and engage this superpower, that superpower. Clearly the world is changing. We are moving into a multipolar world. In the multipolar world, it's going to be a scrum, an equivalent of a rugby scrum. Superpowers are going to be working and scrambling over the ball, and Africa will be one of the playing grounds. So we cannot engage them bilaterally. We need to be able ourselves to organize ourselves. That's why we need this convention. The signs are there, as you are saying. The trade war, we are going to be hit. But in order for us, we can't do it individually. No African country has the capacity to engage the superpowers individually. Yeah. So we must be able to organize ourselves. The issue around the withdrawal of foreign trade, it is a double-edged sword. It is double-edged in that, of course, it has hit a number of NGOs, even tertiary institutions all over Africa, the world, and so on. But it's also a wake-up call, which is a positive element. And I've heard African presidents saying, now is the time for Africa to come to accept. We have to accept it in our own minds that we cannot develop our continent based on the handouts from somebody, no matter how generous is that blesser. Yeah. So we ourselves have to find resources on the African continent. So that is one thing that it's a wake-up call that we have to find resources, and those resources are there. We do have them. But the question is that we need to organize ourselves, not just individual, but also collectively at the regional level as a continent.
Absolutely. Prof, there's so much more I'd like to ask you, but I've got to leave it there for now. And it's the will. We have everything. It's the will to use it and to use the G20 properly, because this is a brilliant, brilliant platform for Africa to sell itself.
Of course.
Prof,
God bless you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very Professor much. Eddy Maloka is a visiting professor at the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation at the University of Johannesburg, reflecting on the African continent's economic and political outlook as we mark Africa Month.